a daylight abduction, mistaken identity, unwilling captivation, itinerary unknown, Estolian princess.
2022.
When motor vehicles became popular, the stray run of Estolia had to decide if it was worthwhile to accommodate them on the island. After much discussion and prayer, they concluded that given the small size of Estolia, the established infrastructure for equestrian transport was sufficient for our modest needs. As air transport became more common, a small airport was constructed to serve the interests of Estolia. By the year 2000, the Estolian airline fleet expanded to include 3 helicopters and 4 private jets. A second airport was constructed on our northern satellite island of Pequeño for the affairs of state that Estolia could not avoid in the modern world. Tier Nen Augustus Zakarion, Capitulo 90.
Zeke wasn't thinking about his surroundings as the carriage left the stable cavern and traveled over the lower palace road towards the temple. Instead, he was trying to figure out the significance of his vision. He had expected this period to be fraught with extraordinary portents regarding his successor. He was not prepared for the sense that it was Rhea whose need was the most acute. Once they arrived at the Amador airport, he helped Kadarin out of the carriage. They were standing on the tarmac next to the carriage horses. At times like this, he was grateful for the influence of Deity over his life. Nearly 31 years ago, he and his uncle Theo stood on the tarmac prior to his planned departure. They had argued at the time, over something inconsequential and long forgotten. He shouted something in response to his uncle's measured tones, the ones he used in teaching and ceremonies. Blazer, one of his favorite carriage horses, reacting to his raised voice, struck out with sharp, deadly hooves and kicked Zeke's leg. The agony had felt otherworldly, muted, peculiar. He looked down at the destruction of his leg and wondered how it happened. With bones protruding, his leg looked like it was severed, and the tarmac was drenched in his blood. It was not until the day his son, Darren, was born that he knew beyond a doubt that Deity had caused the horse to strike him, guided the hooves to make sure his injury would not leave him crippled for life, but would force him to wait to find the love of his life. Yes, he thought now, he had much to be grateful for. Married to Kadarin for 30 years, he still marveled at how extraordinary she was, how enticing her smile, how enchanting the curve of her cheek, how stirring her low timbred voice every time he heard it.
I thank Deity for causing the carriage horse to kick me. I wonder where I would be if I did not receive that incredible guidance. You are everything to me.
He brushed the hair back from her eyes, delighting in the feel of her cheek against his fingertips. She flushed slightly and then embraced him. They would be able to tolerate the separation, but it would not be pleasant.
Hurry home, Ezekiel,
she said softly. She was the only one who regularly called him that, and when she did, it was like an extra layer of love. She stepped back and he reluctantly climbed the steps of the airplane to join the others. Once on board, Zeke closed his eyes for several minutes. Kadarin's final words were liquid fire, flowing through his system. He would ache for her. He was already aching for her. But in her voice, he could hear the words of Deity to Zacharias, that they were surrounded and safe within the arms of Estolia. The problems encountered by being separated would be tolerable, if it was something Deity asked.
Is there some reason you are coming with us, Uncle Zeke?
Nico leaned back in his seat and regarded his uncle with a good-natured expression.
I believe this is one of those rare confluences of circumstance that will require the presence of the Keeper.
He glanced at Max briefly, adding,
Rhea will need spiritual guidance, and you will need to be there to give her advice. You might also find your heart involved in the most unlikely of places.
He leaned back and smiled.
Plus, Max turns 30 a little over a week after you.
He pointed out.
Will you be able to visit Damien?
Nico asked.
I believe I will be able to visit with him as well. He has arranged to travel to stay the night in the city. Visiting him was not, however, the impetus for my journey.
Has it been difficult, Uncle, to advise others on the blessings of marrying on their 30th birthday, while not having had that experience yourself?
Nico asked. Zeke did not answer right away. Not being able to look for his Kaylee prior to his birthday, or for months after, had left him feeling more distance from Deity than at any time before or since. His faith was tested, but in the end the spiritual experience had been worth the struggle. He spent nearly every day of his recuperation communing with Deity, reaching deep within himself to find the faith necessary to get through his trials.
During my recovery, I had a lot of time on my hands.
He said eventually, aware of the question he was leaving unanswered. Nico would have to figure out for himself the answer to his question.
I studied the capítulos and ensayos. I felt as if the depth of spirituality available to me would never have been realized without that critical time in my life. In fact, once you are keeper, I hope to institute a similar course of study for those who wish to take part in it, as a mastery program.
Who will it be for?
Nico asked.
It will be a tertiary level within the temple for those who feel called to learn more, like your cousin Jeremiah. It will be a step above the elders. Those who wish to take on the education of acolytes and elders as their occupation will need to finish the mastery year first. The creation of acolytes was one of the critical developments by Amador towards the end of his tenure as keeper. I believe the mastery year will align with the system of study put in place by our ancestors.
I am sure you will have many men wanting to take part in it. I have never met any man who regrets the year spent studying our history and religion.
Nico said, grinning towards Max.
At least,
Max amended.
not by the end of the acolyte year. Does every class of acolytes have at least one who chooses their own underwear?
Max flushed slightly, clearly remembering the embarrassment he felt when he was the one called out for that infraction.
There is always at least one, but I have never really understood why. It really is quite comfortable.
Zeke said. As keeper, he wore something very much like the acolyte undergarments every day.
Did Amador begin the Elder Year at the same time as the Acolyte Year?
Max asked.
Yes, it was critical in the early years. There were many immigrants to Estolia in those days, and when a man was already married, the studies for acolytes were not appropriate. Even now, we usually have 1 or 2 elders each year who are not Estolian, but who have married one of the daughters of Estolia. They spend a year on the island to learn what they need to know, to help them decide if they wish to accept the faith.
What will the Mastery Year be like?
Max asked.
It will be a year of intense study into the capítulos and ensayos, with some targeted focus that will be decided on an individual basis. The masters will oversee the elders, and elders will continue to oversee the acolytes.
Will the mastery program be required?
Nico asked. Since he would take over from his uncle sometime in the very near future, he would be the one to implement the idea.
Each designate and their leadership team will need to choose to work remotely on their mastery, and anyone else locally in Estolia who wishes to study the religion beyond the Elder Year.
I shall value that contribution.
Nico said. The transition from one keeper to another always had challenges. Zeke had wished for more support from his uncle Theo when he became keeper. He recalled a conversation he had with Theo shortly after Catering gave birth to their first child. They discussed much at the time, but towards the end of the conversation, he asked Theo a question he had wondered about ever since his uncle retired.
Why didn't you remain and help me once I became the keeper?
Theo's answer was ambiguous.
You needed to fly solo, Zeke.
Zeke's thoughts returned to the present. Soon his nephew would take over for him as keeper, but unlike his uncle, he felt a strong compulsion to remain closely involved in the temple and all that went on there.
In her head, strong desire to get her education, her giddy justification, a daylight abduction, mistaken identity.
California visiting, tight itinerary. Keeper traveling away from his Kaylee. Separation from one soul, deviation. painfully on hold.
Halloween County has had an increasing influence over the affairs of Estolia and the project in Hath. What fascinated me was the way it remained obscure almost through the end of the events surrounding the project. By the time Parity began to suspect the importance of the temple in California, they had no chance to infiltrate or change the strength of the stronghold that was developed on the far side of the planet from Hath and Estolia. Lazarus Ezekiel Zakarian, Capitulo 88.
Nico asked the group.
What is our exact itinerary?
Zeke sat forward and gestured to Max.
As I understand it, Maximilian is a groomsman in a wedding shortly after we arrive.
Max smiled broadly. To Nico's eyes, his cousin was the best looking of their current generation, when he was smiling. He hoped fervently that Max would find the perfect woman to keep his soul. Max said,
Dwayne, my college roommate, is marrying the love of his life. He asked me to be his best man. We will arrive too late for me to attend the rehearsal and rehearsal dinner tonight. I will spend the night with him, and then we will go to the wedding tomorrow. I should be back by late afternoon.
After we land, I plan to visit Zeb.
Nico said,
and pass on Mother's love. Then tomorrow I will meet Rhea and the man she is dating for an early dinner.
What are your plans after you visit with Rhea?
Zeke asked.
I was thinking of travelling to Vancouver with Max.
He smiled towards his cousin.
We do not have much time before we turn 30.
After the wedding, I have to check in with both Zakarians and the Domain International corporate offices.
Max added.
Once I have fulfilled my obligations, I will be free to travel to Canada.
I plan to return to Estolia within 3 or 4 days.
Zeke interjected. He looked at Nico and added.
I felt the whisper of the spirit telling me it would be necessary to depart for Estolia quickly, leaving you without transport, Nico. So I went ahead and scheduled another jet. Zeb might fly back with me to see your mother and stick around for a few weeks.
Nico felt the thrill of realization rushing through his system. With their older brother already happily wed, Zeb was visiting Estolia for Nico's benefit. He knew of Nico's birth blessing stating that he would find his Kaylee before his birthday, and place his soul within her keeping on his birthday. Zeb was visiting Estolia to be present once Nico returned, to attend Nico's wedding. As quickly as he thought about finding his Kaylee, his thoughts shifted to his sister, Rhiannon. He was concerned about her. She would turn 22 just 9 days after he turned 30. She was finding the transition to living in the United States difficult. She was dating some loser named James who kept trying to get her to jump into bed with him. He planned to explain the situation to James, forcibly if necessary, that there was no place in Rhea's life for any man trying to coerce her into a physical relationship. A shiver rippled down his spine. James was not his real concern. He frowned and then sat forward, propping his chin in his hands with his elbows on his knees, and tried to discern the source of his disquiet. Rhea would need spiritual counsel, he realized. She would need more than he could give her. She would need the advice of the keeper of the soul of Estolia, but he was not quite ready to fill that position. His uncle, however, was one of the most spiritual keepers ever to grace Estolia. Nico's uncle watched him wrestle with his feelings. When he looked up, their eyes met. They shared a moment of silent communication, one of many between them in the last few months. They understood one another, confirmation that he was destined to be the next keeper.
Rhea's faith will be tested.
Yes. She will, moreover, be the instrument to test the faith of a man who is not Estolian.
Very few non-Estolian men had their faith tested by Deity.
You are flying to California for Rhea.
Nico realized. His eyes flickered over to where Max was reviewing some paperwork on the table in front of him.
Among other reasons.
He added. Zeke smiled at him.
Yes, Nico, I mentioned earlier that this is a confluence of critical events. You, Maximilian, and Rhea.
He smiled as he sat back in his seat.
Your 3 sons will be inseparable.
His uncle was discussing his future child. It seemed unbelievable that he could find the keeper of his soul in so short a time. His blessing was clear: he would fall in love with a woman, and her aura would only confirm her as the woman to keep his soul. He was not sure how it would happen, but he had faith in his blessing and in Deity. Zeke pushed a slender capitulo towards Nico and said,
I have a task for you. Phineas did not have much to say in his capitulo, but his description of the aura is quite moving. I would like you to be able to recite it from memory. Can you do that?
Nico pulled the volume closer. This capitulo happened to be one of his favorites.
Yes, I'm certain I can.
Separation from one soul, deviation painfully unwhole, confluence of three souls, converging on destiny's shores.
Estolian princess in an alien place. In her head, strong desire to get her education. Her giddy justification.
A literate populace is one of the great unsung explanations for Estolia's prosperity. Charlotte Zakarian, Ensayo 85.
Ria glanced at her cell phone. James was more than 20 minutes late. She rehearsed what she planned to say for half an hour before arriving at this out-of-the-way diner. And now he was standing her up. Perhaps, she thought hopefully, this was his way of dumping her. She could only hope he was trying to give her a message. Maybe that was for the best. She would not need to be the one who broke it off. While she waited, she looked through the photo album on her phone. Her father told her she would not like being away from Estolia. He was right. Nothing in this nation made sense to her. The family she was living with were very friendly, but they treated her strangely. She missed the palace and Leon and Nico, and especially her nephew, Tiernan. The strange thing for Ria was how people treated her. In Estolia she thought she was treated like any other citizen. She did not realize how cosseted she was as the daughter of the former king, the sister of the current king, and aunt of the future king. There were many aspects of her life she simply never thought about, until now. She always had someone to clean for her, cook for her, launder her clothing, and prepare her horse and rub it down after she went riding. Her clothing was custom-made by the palace clothier. Coming to live in San Francisco to attend a small private university had turned out to be an eye-opening experience, and not a pleasant one. She was unhappy, not only because it was hard to do for herself what others did for her in Estolia, but because she felt guilty. She wanted to return because she did not want to do those menial tasks. She was homesick for the ease of life in Estolia. A motion out of the corner of her eye caught her attention. A swath of what appeared to be dozens of pieces of American currency were laid on the table in front of her. She looked up at a short man with a scarred face who had put the money on her table in the dimly lit restaurant.
What is this?
The man did not respond to her nervous laughter or quizzical tone. He merely looked across the room until her gaze followed his. A second man sat in a booth watching her. He was dressed in a sophisticated suit and looked out of place in the diner. The scarred man said,
My boss would like you to have a meal with him.
His voice was husky and had a pleasing accent compared to the drawl of Americans. For just a second she was distracted, trying to decide where this man was from. Corsica, she decided, or Menorca.
I do not know your boss. I am here to meet someone else. Why did you put your money on my table?
He wishes you to understand the value he places upon your time. This is yours for gifting him with your company.
He gestured to the money. She pushed the stack of currency away.
No, but thank your boss for the invitation. I am waiting for a friend and would appreciate it if you would take this money and leave.
Many of the Americans she had observed in her time in the United States were rude, overbearing and even crude. She did not admire or desire those traits. Mistaken or not, she would not be rude to this man running an errand for his employer. He smiled slightly before leaving, the stack of bills still on the table in front of her. She was just pushing it aside when she heard the chime of an incoming text message. She read it and frowned at what it said.
Rhea, we both know we're not made for each other. Take care. James.
Typical. Too frightened to face her for the grand breakup. She stood up and pulled on her jacket. She extracted enough money from her purse to pay for her coffee. If the man who sent her the stack of money did not want it, then the waiter could have it. She did not care. She was not going to touch it. After leaving the restaurant, she began walking up the road. While she walked, her thoughts drifted to the future. If she was honest, she did not like being a college student. She was glad that Nico was in town. She could discuss her discontentment with him. She felt a pang of longing for her homeland. She needed to return to Estolia, even if it meant she never found the man who was right for her. She was tired of being separated from everything and everyone she knew and loved.
Mistaken identity, unwilling captivation, itinerary unknown, Estolian princess in an alien place. A daylight abduction, mistaken identity, unwilling captivation, itinerary unknown.
To some of our citizens, the nation's most abiding strength is and always shall be the ever-present touch of Deity blessing the Estolian people. To others, the true strength is the power of love garnered by the exchange of souls. Few can continue to hate within when they have felt their soul keep, or be kept by, another soul. Gallagher Octavian Zakarian, Capitulo 76.
She was not watching where she was going, and a passing cyclist bumped into her. Stumbling, she would have fallen but for the quick thinking of someone else who grabbed her arm and held her upright. But, before she could properly thank him, he was pushing her into a limousine. Confused, she tried to take in her surroundings. By the time she recognized the man from the restaurant, the door had closed and the vehicle was in motion. She tried to figure out how to open the vehicle door, but motor vehicles were so new for her, she could not figure out how to escape.
What do you want?
She asked the man who had sent her money in the diner. She was proud of the way the words came out. She sounded haughty and superior, instead of how she felt, frightened and confused. He smiled at her, making her feel peculiar. With a more distinct accent than his assistant, he said,
I wish to speak with you.
She looked out the window. They were moving away from her neighborhood and towards downtown.
I saw you in the restaurant and was convinced you were without a doubt the most radiant, most beautiful woman in the world. As such, do you blame me for trying to encourage you to eat a meal with me?
She snorted, saying,
Most gentlemen ask a lady out, they do not just throw money at her and expect her to be flattered and consent to a date.
On the contrary, most women of my acquaintance find money a worthy enough incentive for accepting a date.
I am not most women then, because your money does nothing for me.
He leaned forward and said something to the man with the scars who was driving the car. He pulled the vehicle to a halt and got out, leaving her alone with the suave stranger. That was when it finally occurred to her that she might have actually been abducted. After several long minutes, he said to her,
I see now that money is insufficient incentive for a woman with your extraordinary assets.
Let me out at once.
She demanded. Incredulous fury was starting to burgeon within her. The driver's door opened and the chauffeur slipped back inside the limousine, handing his employer a small box before smoothly re-entering traffic.
Here.
He passed her the velvet-covered box.
Is this more the thing that you expect to receive from the men friends you have?
She opened the box and stared at the extravagant jewelry within. During her time in the United States, she had come to understand the relative value of certain things. Jewelry was one of those things. While nowhere near the value of her personal jewels, she knew the necklace in the box was most likely worth a considerable sum. Closing the box with a snap, she tossed it into his lap as if it was burning her hands.
I do not want to have dinner with you or to accept money or jewels from you. I will not share my body with you. I demand that you let me out of this vehicle immediately.
His response was even more infuriating than his earlier presumptions.
I am certain your attitude will change. But you must understand I'm not overly fond of the hard-to-get role.
She sighed, exaggeratedly.
What must I say to get you to understand that I have no interest in you? I do not know who you are, nor do I care. If you do not let me out, I shall be forced to attract the attention of a police officer.
She looked at her phone, hoping to contact Nico. He would come to her rescue. Or Zeb. But her cell phone was not getting any reception. He looked at her thoughtfully for several minutes before saying,
Perhaps this role, that of the hard-to-convince woman, is one of your specialities. I think I might like it after all.
He stopped speaking and nodded decisively as if he had come to some understanding within himself.
I shall pay you double the amount I normally pay. Maxine will not learn from me how lucrative our transaction was for you. I shall enjoy exploring this role with you.
He looked like he had satisfactorily concluded some tricky business deal. Sitting back, he waited for her to happily jump at his offer. Except nothing he said made any sense. She sifted through his words and latched onto one thing.
Just who do you think I am?
He raised one dark, elegant eyebrow.
One of Maxine's girls. I told her I liked variety, that I wished to have a woman to be my companion for the next week who would be neither coarse nor too obviously experienced. I am flattered she would know me well enough to send you.
His eyes were warm as they traveled over her curves. Discussion about desire and physical relationships were commonplace in Estolia, but it was not typical to have a man discuss what sounded like prostitution. She could feel the heat of a blush staining her cheeks.
You think I am some sort of call girl? You are mistaken. I do not know anyone by the name of Maxine. Now, let me out.
She was proud of her ability to keep her voice even and calm. So far, he had given no sign that he intended to force himself on her, but she did not want to antagonize him. Deity would protect her, just as her aunt Kaderin had been protected when she was kidnapped. Rhea had to firmly suppress the fear that was eroding her fury. His eyes narrowed and he looked her up and down again, a perplexed frown wrinkling his brow. He said something to the driver and a second later was handed a phone. He spoke in an unfamiliar language before terminating the call.
It appears I owe you an apology. You are not the girl Maxine reserved for me,
he said. She smiled, relieved that he finally believed her.
Perhaps now you will stop and let me out?
He smiled too, but she was wary of the expression.
You intrigue me. I would still like to spend the next week in your company. As you are not working for Maxine, you will not need to share any of the commission with her.
I do not want to have anything to do with you. Are you unable to understand plain English? Did you not hear what I said?
Yes, I did in fact hear what you said to me. Your well-worded rejection was clear and concise,
he said.
But you apparently did not hear my words. I desire you. No matter what sort of price you have on your body, I assure you I can pay it. So, let us dispense with modesty and get this unpleasant business of money out of the way, so we can move on to finding pleasure with one another. I assure you, I am not a selfish lover.
He paused, studying her face, before he asked.
Tell me plainly, what price do you place upon your time? What motivates a woman as exquisite as you?
The car entered an exclusive parking garage.
If you asked me politely to go on a date with you, I might have said yes. If you want me to sleep with you, I do not think you could pay my price.
She wanted to shock him, make him listen to her.
Name it,
he said. His eyes were running over her generous curves.
The only man who will possess my body is the man who will marry me.
If he would not listen to protestations of disinterest, perhaps he would pay more attention to her if she brought up marriage. Her eyes met his, hoping he would see the sincerity in her gaze.
If I yield up my body to any man who does not become my husband, I would ruin irrevocably the ability to marry. No amount of money is worth a lifetime of loneliness and the destruction of my dreams.
When the car came to a halt, he asked,
"Will you at least agree to continue this fascinating conversation with me in the comfort of my apartment?"
Not even sure what possessed her to do so, she agreed.
Estolian princess in an alien place, in her headstrong desire to get her education, her giddy justification, a daylight abduction, mistaken identity.
Apollyon's choices as heir, cruel animal abuser, seducer of innocence, leonine panther in his lair.
As I meditated one fine spring day, I thought about the lost of Estolia, those who left after Alexandros's actions. I knew that Cathaia, who left because of Apollyon, prophesied that those who left would be cursed with only a single child in any generation, until such time as they returned to Estolia. While Carolina did not know anything beyond the name of her mother, I believe that she is the first of the lost to return to Estolia. She is the daughter of Hector and Maya Beltran, the woman who keeps my soul and enables me to keep the soul of Estolia. I am certain that each of those who left Estolia will, in time, return to the fold. I can only hope that each return will be as joyous and momentous as Carolina's. Hezekiah Rolando Zakarian, Capítulo 63.
The elevator doors opened to a vast, spacious penthouse. The Othello building loomed tall, and just beyond it, the Dumaine International Tower. She was comforted to know that her brother was supposed to meet her there in just a couple of hours. She felt peace wash through her, Deity was watching out for her. She wished she had a greater grasp on the teachings of Zacharias for situations like this. The lack of spiritual training for the daughters of Estolia was one of the most grievous deficiencies in her nation. Once she extricated herself from this situation, she would discuss making a change in Estolia. As much as she felt the spirit telling her she would be safe, she also felt the gaps in her knowledge. Women needed religious instruction, too. Her abductor finally responded to her statement about marriage.
"I do not plan to marry any woman who has been free with her favors."
He stood behind her, his words rolling out with a peculiar, rhythmic cadence she reluctantly found attractive.
"Surely you have accepted less from your other lovers? I can be incredibly generous."
She turned her back on the view and looked at him. He was attractive, very attractive, but he was not listening to her.
"I have not been free with my favors,"
she said firmly,
"and I have no intention of giving my virginity to any man other than the one I marry."
He looked skeptical.
"You do not expect me to believe you are a virgin. You look most skilled at the intricacies of love."
She was reminded of when she auditioned for the part of the young innocent for a play to be presented by the college thespians. She was dismayed when she got the part of the femme fatale. The director of the play said to her,
"Ria, you may fit the character of the innocent in this play, but you don't look like an innocent. You look like a seductress, tempting men into acts of adultery."
She learned quickly in her time at the university that many people tended to think of her in that way, that she was free with her favors, willing to steal men from other women, and sleeping with any man on their first date. It was the curse of inheriting her mother's red hair and sultry good looks.
"Look,
she said,
I do not know who you are. My brothers will kill you if you take my virtue from me. You appear to wield power and wealth. My family are familiar with both of those."
She glanced over to where his driver stood by the elevator, effectively blocking any escape, even if she could get the elevator to work without the key card.
"Do you intend to rape me?"
she asked, lifting her chin and meeting his eyes, hoping to shock him. She was successful. His eyes widened and then he frowned, a look of distaste on his face.
"I would not have to resort to rape. Every woman has a price. I must merely discover yours, and I will have you."
Something she had read in one of the ensayos came back to her.
How old are you?
She asked him. He looked startled at the question. One eyebrow rose in query before he moved to a cabinet against one wall. Extracting a bottle, he opened it and poured 2 glasses of wine. He handed her one and then answered.
I will be 30 tomorrow.
She took a sip of the golden wine. When the flavor hit her palate, she glanced down at the glass in surprise. It was the Danieli vintage, a wine she knew well, originating in Estolia. It was ironic that he was planning to use her family wine to seduce her. Another indication of his wealth, the Danieli was one of the most expensive wines one could buy. It was sold in extremely limited quantities outside of Estolia. She studied him while she sipped the wine. He was relaxed and clearly confident that he had already made his conquest. He was tall and dark and self-assured. He carried the air of power and wealth like some men carried their briefcases. She realized that, in other circumstances, he was the sort of man her brothers would instinctively gravitate towards. Thinking about her brothers made her realize she needed Nico's guidance. Perhaps this man knew her brother? Zeb spent most of his time in Spain, but when he was in the States, he was in San Francisco.
Do you know my brother Sebastiani Zakarian?
She asked. He was just taking a sip of the golden wine, but at her question, he almost choked on the liquid. He swallowed and then set his glass down and stared at her, rapping out.
What is your name?
Rhiannon Caledonia Zakarian,
she stated.
My father is Isaiah Monterey Zakarian. My 3 brothers are Leonidas, Nicodemus, and Sebastiani.
You are Estolian?
He said. She nodded.
I'm Estolian.
He turned away from her and walked over to the man standing in front of the elevator. He spoke to him rapidly. The scarred man glanced her way before stepping into the elevator and departing. She watched as her abductor stood staring at the closed elevator, while a clock somewhere in the apartment ticked loudly. Finally, he pivoted and came up to her.
Please have a seat,
he said as he gestured to a casual arrangement of colorful chairs.
With all the promises of Zacharias, with Estolia on the line, lack of faith would try all of us, we would lose all we gain. Alexandros as the last resort. The brightest dawn, the most glorious sunset, to grace mine eyes, the beauty of 1,000 lifetimes all surpassed in that one moment.
Poetry is one of the ways that Estolians like to express themselves. Perhaps because the unique character of organization of Estolian script lends itself well to the structure, rhyme, and meter of poetry. Often the most mundane of texts ends up sounding like poetry. Alexandros, the last resort for Apollyon, wrote one of the more meaningful and poetic passages in his Capitulo. A stranger, hearing the passage spoken out loud, could be forgiven for thinking that they had just listened to an epic poem. The truth, his treatise on the promise he made to Deity if Ulysses lived through the ordeal of losing his foot, is much more mundane. He promised to spare the life of an island goat, and to encourage the 4-horned variety rather than trying to cull them. Meredith Zakarian, History of Estolia.
After they sat down, he studied her appearance, from her red hair to her amber eyes and generous curves of her body.
I do know your brother, as you surmised. I always research those with whom I interact and do business. From what I have learned, I can infer that you, as Estolian, were serious in your assertions.
He leaned backwards. After another long pause, he said,
I still desire you.
I do not believe you would find the reward worth the cost, especially now.
She did not understand this type of situation within the context of the Estolian faith. She could not blunder forward in ignorance.
I must call Nico.
Not your oldest brother?
Leon is in Estolia, most likely asleep.
She dismissed.
Nico, on the other hand, is expecting me this evening. I believe you would find meeting him enlightening.
He studied her expression before he gestured assent. She pulled her cell phone out of her pocket and saw it at service again. She dialed Nico's number and then left the phone on speaker.
Ria!
Her brother spoke in Estolian, his voice agitated.
I have been trying to reach you for the last hour. Where are you?
You should come to the penthouse of the Carpathia building,
she said in English.
I am in need of your spiritual advice.
After a very long pause, he responded in English.
Uncle Zeke said you would need advice. He even flew here with me.
She looked at the stranger whose name she still did not know, and asked him,
Will you accept a visit from my brother and my uncle?
He inclined his head in agreement. Once she terminated the call, he said to her,
I find this latest adventure, with all of its twists and turns, intriguing. What do you expect to happen? Did you invite them simply to rescue you from my licentious clutches?
Her eyes met his steadily so he would understand the level of seriousness behind her words.
In the Estolian faith, once a man is 30, it is time for him to marry. Our marriage ceremony is simple. Nico will explain better than I could. What I do know, however, is that if you are 30 and you take my virginity, you are giving me your soul. You will die if you do not marry me.
He burst out laughing, which did not surprise her.
I am not Estolian, and therefore have no reason to ascribe to the peculiarities of your faith.
I expect my brother and my uncle will be able to explain it better than I can, and with much greater clarity of detail.
A melodic chime sounded and was followed by the scarred man escorting both her brother and her uncle into the penthouse. Both looked relieved to see that she was unharmed. Nico crossed the room swiftly to her side, glancing only briefly at the stranger before searching her face.
You are okay?
He asked in Estolian.
Yes, brother, I am.
She also glanced at the stranger before saying,
He sees my aura. He will be 30 tomorrow.
Nico's nostrils flared as he took in her meaning.
You are tempted by him as much as he is tempted by you.
She had no response to that assertion. She turned to watch her uncle as he approached her stranger. She felt comforted by the weight of Nico's arm around her shoulder.
I am Lazarus Ezekiel Zakarian.
Her uncle introduced himself.
And this is my nephew, Nicodemus Luciano Zakarian.
My name is Zer Alfonso Amador.
You are a descendant of Zacharias.
Uncle Zeke declared. The stranger inclined his head and said,
Far back in my ancestry, as I understand it, one of my ancestors came from the island. Many hundreds of years ago, however, so it is entirely irrelevant.
Zeke glanced at Ria before looking back at her enigmatic stranger.
My nephew could sense Ria's turmoil and the force of your encounter even at a distance.
His voice was taking on the tone of finality she had heard him use only a few times in her life. Zahir did not comment, so he continued.
Fate has intervened in your affairs, Jare Amador, and dictates that you are at a most extraordinary crossroad in your life. Would you be willing to hear a very small portion of the writings of Phineas Alistair Zakarian?
He inclined his head in acquiescence, humor still lifting the corners of his mouth as if he thought his visitor's religious beliefs to be little more than comedic. Ria sipped at the golden wine and turned to listen to her brother.
The brightest dawn, the most glorious sunset to grace mine eyes, the beauty of 1,000 lifetimes, all surpassed in that one moment when I stumbled unaware on the keeper of my soul. In the brilliance of her aura, I could see the promises of Deity, the absolute certainty of Zacharias in his Estoliana, like a soul, my soul, a flame. The woman who would compass my world was made known to me in the purity and intensity of an aura much greater in its radiant brilliance, its crystalline clarity, than any the prophets foretold. In every color of the rainbow radiating from her heart, my future happiness depended on my embracing her as my Kaylee. In moments I was making excuse to touch her hand, and I could feel the exquisite pleasure pain of a soul that knew it found its home but had no right to reside therein. I knew I would fade with similar speed as her glorious aura, if I were unwilling to embrace my destiny and place within her safekeeping the entirety of my soul. In the glimmering of her fading aura, I was rewarded with one jewel-bright final scintillation, as I determined to make her mine and place my soul within her keeping.
As I determined to make her mine and place my soul within her keeping.
A daylight abduction, mistaken identity, unwilling captivation, itinerary unknown.
As an elder, one of my favorite lessons, while teaching the acolytes, was when I asked them to imagine the aura. I enjoyed the twist I put on the assignment when I asked them to revise their work and eliminate every reference to vision. They were asked to describe the aura, but limit it to smell and sound, taste and touch. I did not realize the impact this assignment would end up having on Gordon, one of my acolytes. When he lost his sight less than a year later, he said that he would have felt tremendous despair if he did not believe firmly that the aura was truly the amalgam of multiple senses. Without that lesson, he may have fallen into a fatal depression after he was deprived of his sight. When he became one of our most celebrated poets, I knew that Deity was with us, guiding and shaping us to tread upon the pathway of happiness as well as enlightenment. Valentine Amador, Mastery Essay.
Phineas was the most comprehensive and poetic description of the aura.
Nico said.
Did you see my sister's aura?
Sher looked at Rhea, a slightly puzzled look on his face.
She seemed, when I first saw her, to glow golden, like the finest tiger's eye stone, as if there was some special allure to her beyond any other woman I have ever known. And my desire to possess her was great. I decided that I would have her, regardless of the cost.
That is what an aura is like. Special, indescribable, alluring.
Uncle Zeke stated.
I am not Estolian.
Sher asserted. His earlier convictions seemed to have faded.
It should not matter if I have seen Rhiannon's aura.
Even if it does not matter to you, it matters to Rhea.
Nico interjected, indignant on her behalf, pulling her body closer to his protectively. Uncle Zeke glanced towards them briefly, a quelling expression on his face, before looking back at their host. He used his lilting instructor voice, one Rhea could never forget from her youth. With it he could deliver lessons that never needed a second telling.
Not all ascribe to our faith. Indeed, we would be most hard-pressed to accommodate the needs of even 1% of the religious-minded on this planet, were they to declare belief in our religion. But among the descendants of Zacharias and Estoliana, the blessings and the curses bestowed are as incontrovertible as the laws of nature and physics. You have the blood of Zacharias. You have felt the pull of those selfsame blessings and seen the aura. You have met the keeper of your soul, your Kaylee. You have only two choices.
Nico took up the narrative and Rhea marveled at the strength her brother was gaining in his rapid progress towards his destiny.
You can ask the three of us to depart,
he said,
rejecting Rhea and all she stands for. This will result, ultimately, in a future of celibacy. Few men can meet the woman who would be the keeper of their soul and reject her, untouched.
His voice grew much darker as he added,
Those who walk away from the woman who has already taken possession of their soul, walk away from life itself. No man can exist without his soul.
Sher looked unconvinced.
And my other choice?
Nico smiled and looked at Rhea. She knew this was her cue. She crossed the room slowly, looking at this man who had swept into her life like a freight train. She wanted him. She could reject Sher and return to Estolia. He would be unable to follow her there. His body would not rise for any other woman. But if she rejected him, would she be rejecting Deity, and the declaration Deity made, by showing him her aura, that they were perfectly matched? This was one of the chasms in her understanding of the promise of Zacharias and Deity's promised blessings. Were her choices limited now and for all time? Could she only ever experience the ultimate for a woman of Estolia if she was willing to marry this man? Many times, she had railed at the inequity of being a daughter of Estolia, subjected to the whims of its dictates. Why was it, she had asked her mother, that only men saw the aura? Why was the choice given to a man to accept the woman? Where was the choice for the woman? Her mother explained the true power in Estolia was always within the women who kept the souls of their men. Deity would never show a man the aura of a woman if he was not right for her. It was not written in so many words, but it was understood by the women of Estolia. They had a power far greater than that of the men of Estolia. The power within her, that she now felt as never before, was as real as the sun and the earth. If she allowed this man to possess her, she would take his soul into her keeping, giving her a strength impossible to fathom. Once it was in her keeping, he had only two choices: to remain with her, his fate sealed to hers for all time, or to reject her, and languish without his soul, to die a lonely death. But he had to understand his choices. If she had allowed him to possess her body as part of a transitory relationship, her suffering would not be as overt, but it would be no less acute. She would be rejecting the Estolian way, and choosing a pathway that would preclude a normal, soul-satisfying connection with some man later in her life. Given the consequences, and her own ignorance as to other options, it seemed to make the most sense to try to get him to accept her, and all that she represented. For Estolians, courtship always seemed to follow one of two patterns. Sometimes a couple just knew that Deity approved their match. Often, they spent a significant amount of time together, though rarely alone, prior to his 30th birthday. In that situation, there was no expectation that the man would see an aura. They would seek permission to have their seclusion in the temple, and go there joyously on the eve of his birthday. The other model of courtship centered around women who were not raised in Estolia, who frequently knew nothing about the nation or the faith. They nearly always showed their aura to some Estolian nearing his birthday, confirming the woman as the right one to keep his soul. When the aura was viewed in conjunction with a man's 30th birthday, intimacy was usually not long in following. While this would seem precipitous to those of other faiths and societies, in Estolia it was considered typical. There was no reason to forego the blessings that come to a couple who consummated their union on the man's birthday, just to postpone intimacy. Not when Deity clearly indicated that the union would be sanctioned in 7 days. Sometimes only seconds passed between introduction and the desire to create a fusion of two souls, resilient and ready to face the rest of the world at the end of their seclusion. He may not believe what her Uncle Zeke and Nico were telling him. But she had no doubts about it. If he held the blood of Zacharias in his veins and saw her aura, her touch would seal his attraction to her and compel compliance. Knowing it was not fair, she reached out and touched his face. She could feel Estoliana's power as it was bestowed upon her, and she knew he would be unable to resist the lure she represented.
You can choose, Zer Amadora, to try to convince me to couple my life with yours. If you succeed, you will feel the tremendous blessings Zacharias foretold for those with the courage to embrace the faith. I have heard,
she paused to muse at the power her own voice was taking on,
that the pleasure in being with the keeper of your soul, your Kaylee, is far more than any pleasure you may have known up until now.
His hair looked like he was entranced by what he was seeing. His earlier lust transformed to a desire to more than just know her physically.
You are all saying I am committed to Rhiannon and that our futures are tied together.
Yes.
Zeke said.
Know also that if you do choose to take her to bed, she will conceive. The exchange has 3 aspects. You give her your soul, she gives you her purity, and Deity gives both of you a son to bless the relationship.
Hare nodded decisively.
If you gentlemen will return tomorrow, I believe Rhiannon and I have an appointment with destiny.
Nico frowned, glancing from his uncle to Hare, and then to Rhea. Finally, he focused all of his attention on his sister.
Do you wish to remain here, Rhea?
She looked up into her brother's face and had to suppress tears at how dear he was to her, how blessed she was to have him and 2 other fine brothers. She looked from Nico to Hare and then nodded.
I will be fine here, Nico, I am sure.
Some of the tension seemed to leak out of his frame and he pulled her close in a hug before he and Zeke left the penthouse apartment.
Estolian princess in an alien place. In her head, strong desire to get her education. Her giddy justification. Introspection, intervention, concatenation, amalgamation. In the fertile fields of body, soul, and heart, Deity knows all you need.
Our faith revolves around ideas unknown in any other religion. We believe a man is compelled to set aside all women but one. Once he turns 30, then he must find a woman who is pure and untouched, a virgin, and have an exchange with her. When he takes her purity, he takes something of great value from her and must give her something of like value in return. To us, that means that the man gives to the woman his soul. Once he has found the keeper of his soul, a man cannot find sexual desire or pleasure in any other woman. Deity takes a strong hand and guides us to the right woman, guards us from making wrong choices, and for our willingness to yield up our lives and futures to these beliefs, we are provided great rewards, far beyond anything those who are not Estolian will ever experience. Isaiah Balthazar Zakarian, Capitulo 88.
Once Nico and her uncle Zeke left, Rhea looked at the handsome man who believed he was going to possess her. When he stepped towards her, she held up her hand to stop him. She had to get a few things clear with him before they did anything else. She knew in her heart that she had to have faith in Deity that this was right for her. He raised one eyebrow and waited.
It is not as simple as you seem to think. Not only do you face a decision, but you must then convince me you are worth accepting.
Her eyes met his.
Why, Jare Amadore, should I accept a man who has frequented call girls? What makes you worthy of me?
His eyes moved down her body slowly before climbing to take in her glorious red hair. Finally, he met her eyes, and there was something within them she did not understand. It felt, to her, that Deity was speaking to her in some way. He inclined his head and said to her,
Rhiannon Caledonia Zakarian, I am most pleased to meet you. Would you do me the greatest of favors and consent to dine with me this evening?
I would love to.
Then she realized she had none of her fancy dresses in California.
I do not have the right sort of attire for a formal meal.
If you will gift me with your company, I will provide you with the appropriate outfit for the evening.
The charm he was suddenly sending her way was enough to ratchet up her pulse rate.
I would like that.
An hour later she was at an exclusive boutique having a pedicure and a manicure. Her college co-ed looks melted away under the expert ministrations of several beauticians. While they worked, another woman created an exclusive one-of-a-kind dress that would look perfect. She remembered similar days in Estolia, being pampered, having the dressmaker create delightful dresses and outfits for her. She felt a pang of longing for home. Would she ever return if she accepted this man? The enormity of her decision suddenly hit her, and she did not know what she would do. She recalled when she touched his face, and the way he looked at her, as if she had physically tied him to her permanently. The link seemed to work both ways, she also felt tied to him. When Zhe reappeared at the boutique, she stared at their reflection as they stood side by side. The dress was the embodiment of the ocean, with multiple colors from slate gray to deep enchanting purple, from rich emerald green to vibrant teal. The necklace he fastened around her neck had twisted strings of emeralds, amethysts, and sapphires. It was the way he looked at her, and something different in the way she carried herself. Somehow, she felt fundamentally transformed by more than a beauty treatment.
Men never refer to Deity by gender.
Her mother told her during one of their long discussions.
Because sometimes it makes them uncomfortable to admit that Deity is female. Our faith has few rules, but the ones it does have are all about the actions of the men. Deity cares for us, Rhea, and part of that caring is making sure we are never forced to accede to the unrighteous demands and needs of men who are not worthy of us. When a man sees your aura, Rest assured that it will happen only if you are right for him, and he is right for you.
Ria's eyes met Ser's and saw a message in them that brought a blush to her cheeks. His voice was solemn, and his accent was more noticeable than ever when he said,
I was wrong, Rhiannon, when I said you were the most beautiful woman in the world. I believe you define beauty.
He extended an arm to her, and she took it, feeling the warmth of his flesh beneath the garment. She was attracted to him in a way that was new to her. Before now, she had never wondered what it felt like to be unclothed and in a man's arms. He escorted her out of the salon and across the street towards the Othello building.
We will be dining with Michael Othello, his girlfriend Aria Wellington, dear Casad Falco, and Falco's wife, Kestrel.
He told her.
It took me nearly 10 weeks to set up this dinner, so I cannot avoid it.
Michael Othello and dear Casad Falco were two of the most talked about men on the news. Though they were only in the planning stages, the two men would be creating an impressive think tank with the grandiose and heavily mocked purpose of saving the planet. They called it the Project, and it would be located in dear Casad's home country of Hath. She did not know if they would be successful. She was impressed that Ser was dining with the two men. It might not be the most romantic of first dates, but she sensed it could help her decide whether or not she should accept Ser. In the Othello building, they passed through several security checkpoints before being escorted out of the elevator and into a luxurious apartment. Ser led her towards the suave, urbane Michael Othello. Next to him was a shorter man with a swarthy complexion, and accompanied by a sleek woman. Michael Othello stepped forward and said,
My good friend Ziri, I'm so pleased to finally introduce you to dear Casad Falco and his dear Kestrel. This is Zira Medora.
Ser put an arm around Ria's waist.
And this is Rhiannon Zakarian?
He said.
I hope to convince her to marry me before the night is over.
Amalgamation in the fertile fields of body, soul, and heart. Deity knows all you need to be a part. Introspection, intervention, concatenation, amalgamation, in line with deity. A daylight abduction, mistaken identity, unwilling captivation, itinerary unknown.
The teachings of Zacharias regarding the aura are hard to grasp for those who do not grow up steeped in the religion and history of Estolia. Few outsiders feel the lure of the aura. But suppose a man has the great fortune to encounter one of the daughters of Estoliana during his 30th year. In that case, it is entirely possible that he will, while unaware of the repercussions of his actions, place his soul within her keeping. Phineas Alistair Zakarian, Capitulo 81.
By the time Ser escorted her back to his apartment, Ria felt charmed. There he poured her another glass of the golden wine. He took her empty hand and led her over to the colorful chairs they had occupied earlier in the day. Once seated, Ser said,
You asked me earlier why you should accept a man who has frequented call girls.
I did.
She said.
I feel less worried now, but still.
She did not know how to put her concerns into words. His reminder brought her objection back to the forefront of her mind. She knew that most Estolian men had affairs in their younger years before settling down with their Kaylee. The women of Estolia accepted the double standard without question, though more of them were becoming vocal on the subject. Even so, it was not normal for women to be confronted with the details of their husbands' prior sexual escapades. For most women it was a vague time in their man's life, a stage of maturation they went through and got over, whose outcome was never doubted, that the man who chose the woman was not just unlikely to stray, but incapable of doing so. How much would she learn about Ser? What had he done before seeing her aura? Would the same constraints bind him as normal Estolians? Ser said.
From a young age, I have had a high libido, a sex drive more powerful than most young men. My uncle, who raised me, told me when I was 16 that it was important for me to use wisdom when it came to my sexual liaisons in my youth. And when ready for marriage, that I select wisely. He suggested I hold off on dating altogether until I was ready to marry, that I avail myself of the women who are a part of the network I spoke of earlier. These are women who have been left alone in life, their spouses dead or disabled, their ability to earn curtailed by a lack of education or opportunity.
He paused to sip his wine, looking away from her with a frown.
My uncle suggested there was no shame in availing myself of the services of such women. They would receive remuneration for their understanding, and as a result, I would not have to worry about my female companions having the wrong ideas about our association. When it was time for me to ultimately seek a bride, they would accept the situation without recriminations.
He grimaced slightly, adding,
He did elicit a promise from me that I limit my sexual exploits to the women who are a part of this particular network. This would, he told me, accomplish many critical things at the one time. I would be safe against the insidious evils of sexually transmitted infections. In addition, I would never unknowingly take a woman against her will, or discover myself with a woman who was not yet old enough to consent.
He paused again, his eyes on his glass. He took a deep breath before looking up.
I do not know if it is merely a case of rationalization and justification for actions that you will deem unforgivable, but I would like to believe my association with the different women over the years has achieved more than my own satisfaction. I recently received a card from the woman who first taught me how to give women pleasure. She was a widow when I met her, and she told me that it was through my generosity that she was able to return to school and pay for childcare for her 3 children. Not long ago she remarried, and all of her children are in college. The oldest is now planning to be a pediatrician when she graduates.
Do you intend to be true to me?
Rhea blurted out. Her hand was shaking and she set the glass down so he would not see how wobbly she was feeling. This was what mattered to her. She needed to know that they would have the same type of relationship as her relatives, a soul-deep connection that would transcend death, that would bring great happiness in this life, and the promise of something truly special in Torisen. She would rather spend her life alone than waste it with a man who would never really embrace Estolian principles.
Your brother Nico and your uncle Zeke both seem to believe I would find it impossible to become aroused by another woman. Is that not true?
Once again, she felt the chasm of her ignorance yawning in front of her. It was insupportable that the women of Estolia were not given a comparable religious education as the men. She would have a long chat about the matter with her brother when she returned to Estolia.
I do not know that I understand it properly,
she admitted to him.
Let us assume that it is not true. If you could, would you be unfaithful?
She picked up her wine glass and took a small sip, more relaxed now that she had shared her deepest concern. Hare did not respond right away. Instead, he set his glass down, and took her glass from her, setting it next to his. He got to his feet and urged her to stand. He was close enough, as he looked into her amber eyes, for her to feel the heat of his skin and to see a pulse beating in his temple. She could see the irises of his eyes, they were a vibrant blue. In that moment, she felt as if she was on a magic carpet ride guided by Deity. Where was Deity taking them?
I think, Rhiannon, the crossroads your relatives referred to is deeply significant. From the instant I saw you, I desired you. I am enchanted by you. Intrigued. I wish to make love to you until you are gasping my name with pleasure. I want to create a child with you. I look forward to the way your body will swell with a child that will be, quite literally, flesh of our flesh. I saw you sparkle and charm Michael Othello and dear Cussat Falco, and I could not help comparing you to the 2 other women.
He lifted a hand to her shoulder, one thumb brushing along her collarbone.
I must confess that it is typical for me to desire women. I often fight down the physical response of my body to the beautiful women who surround me. What is new is this focus I have on you now, Rhiannon, and only on you. Those other 2 women left me cold.
I could not even comprehend what it would be like to wish for intimacy with them. How could I, when the only woman on my mind is you? I cannot even imagine what it is like to desire another woman anymore.
He whispered. The hand at her waist slipped lower, pulling her hips closer to his. He moved closer to her until his body was touching hers. He dipped his head down until his lips were hovering over hers.
Be mine.
She freed several additional buttons from their moorings until she had full access to him. She caressed his shoulders when his mouth covered hers, the gentle questioning kiss transforming into an inferno of desire. The silky swirl of her dress slithering down her legs brought her back into focus. His chest was bare and she realized with a flush that her hands were resting on his belt. The memory of wrestling with it came back to her.
I want to kiss you, Rhiannon.
When she offered no objections, his mouth settled over hers in a kiss that spread warmth through her entire body, echoing in her extremities. One hand slipped around her waist, the other held her head. His lips were gentle, asking, sharing. He did not take, did not plunder. When he finally pulled back, she realized in a daze that she had unbuttoned the shirt he wore and was caressing the heated skin of his chest. Her eyes met his in shock.
Zara.
She felt more than the flame of wanting that already consumed her imagination. She felt possessive of the man pressed against her. She took 2 steps back and looked at him. His eyes met hers and he lifted his hands to finish unfastening his pants. He pushed them down, bending over to remove them. When he straightened up, he was standing in front of her gloriously naked. She felt overdressed and knew he could remove her garments faster than she could. She moved closer and turned her back to him so he could unfasten her bra. When her undergarments fell to the carpet, she turned around again to face him. Across each of his cheekbones was a hint of color, the flush of desire, and he was breathing heavily. His eyes held hers before he took her hands and spread her arms to look at her. He sucked in his breath, his eyes rapidly taking in every detail of her body, full breasts, slender waist, slightly rounded stomach, wide hips, and flame-red curls at the apex of her thighs. When his eyes returned to hers, he said,
Rhiannon, you are the most exquisite woman I have ever met in my entire life. Will you be mine, Rhiannon?
He asked her again.
If you really mean it to last forever,
she whispered.
I am yours, Zara Amador.
She could not deny him, could not deny them. He led her to his bedroom, stopping beside his bed to kiss her again. Time ceased to matter. They went from tangled and standing to entwined upon the bed, exploring and discovering the nuances of one another. His hands and mouth wandering over her body brought every nerve ending quivering to life. The final melding of their bodies was as necessary as breathing. She gasped at the exquisite sensation of completion that swept through her, overcome by the duet of 2 bodies perfectly in harmony with one another. Pleasure stormed through them, sealing their union with the promised blessing of Deity in gifting them a perfect connection with one another. This was what her mother had repeatedly tried to explain. The sensation of holding Hare's soul within her own was pure pleasure. When they both finally settled back to earth, their breathing and heartbeats no longer racing, he said, I do not think, Rhiannon, that I could have accepted any other woman but you, once you were mine, even if I did not know the first thing about your faith. She kissed the warm skin of his chest, marveling at the sensations that continued to sweep through her body, his spicy scent, the feel of slightly damp skin against hers, his heart beating, and the memory of the surge of his body within her own.
Estolian princess in an alien place, in her headstrong desire to get her education, her giddy justification, a daylight abduction, mistaken identity, unwilling captivation, itinerary unknown.